Is our society's future technological path already predetermined, or can we influence it? And if we can, how should we shape how our technological progress happens? Joining me this episode are Daron Acemoğlu and Simon Johnson. Daron is the Institute Professor of Economics at MIT and the author of books such as Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor. Simon Johnson is the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, current professor at MIT, and author of such books as White House Burning and 13 Bankers, and together they are the co-authors of the new book Power and Progress, about how technology, growth, and inequality intersect. We discuss Acemoğlu and Johnson's idea that technological growth does not automatically lead to material gains for normal people. We discuss how those gains for the masses actually happen, whether or not we should democratically control the direction of technology, and how we can best shape the future that we all want with tech policy. If you enjoy the podcast, please make sure to go like and subscribe. If you really enjoy the podcast, you can become a supporter on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Members and patrons get benefits like access to our Slack, bonus episodes, and much more. Thank you for your support, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me in this episode are Simon Johnson and Daron Acemoğlu. Simon and Daron, welcome to the show.
Nice with you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Happy to be here.
All right, so the first question that I want to ask is kind of a 10,000-foot question about this book. It seems like this book, Power and Progress, which is about the intersection of kind of how society advances and how technology advances, and whether or not that necessarily leads to human flourishing in kind of a wide spectrum, it seems like this is a conversation between two schools of thought. There's the Tyler Cowen style of optimism about growth, to parody that a little bit, it's, growth is all that matters in the long run. And then there's this separate line of thinking that would say, well, that's not a good enough approach. We have to care about how growth is implemented and how technology is implemented. Is that something you thought about when you were kind of sketching the outline for what you wanted this book to be, this kind of conversation between different ways of thinking about technological growth?
Yes, I think that's certainly an element. I don't think I would put Tyler necessarily or as strongly in just one category as you do, Jeremiah. I think when we talk in the book a lot about techno-optimists, and when we single out people in the technology industry who are pushed very hard for more innovation for its own sake. But yes, certainly we are in the business of disputing that just innovating, just creating new things, or just developing more, better artificial intelligence will necessarily deliver benefits for most people within the foreseeable future.
I'm reminded of kind of the phrase creative destruction, which economists talk about all the time. It's this, idea that goes back hundreds of years. And most economists, probably the vast majority of economists, would say that creative destruction is a good thing in the long run. But it's always interesting to me that the word destruction is actually part of that phrase. And I think that sometimes can get glossed over that, we are actually destroying things when we kind of make change to society in some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, if you say you are for or against creative destruction, that already conditions the debate in a specific way. It sort of makes it sound like the only way you can have progress is by this destructive process, and there's nothing you can do about it and just suffer that destruction. And that is part of innovation, or you can block innovation. We are sort of refusing that in some sense. What we're saying is that the degree of creation and destruction that you get out of technology is a matter of choice. Technology is very malleable. We can create lots of new tasks and lots of new capabilities for workers while we're also displacing them from some tasks, and while we're also creating new disruptions, or we can create huge amounts of wealth for some people and not enough new jobs for workers, and that's another choice. There are many other choices as well, but we have to recognize that creative destruction itself doesn't come in a prepackaged way. So creative destruction versus no creative destruction, I no longer think is the right frame.
So as part of this kind of conversation about how technology advances and whether or not it actually benefits everyone and or just benefits a narrow set of elites, the book draws an interesting distinction to me that I want to ask you about. There's this distinction that I think you guys draw between acts of technological progress that kind of are additive, that create new things, that create new tasks or new jobs or new opportunities for labor. And then there's a different kind of technological progress that you contrast, which is just automation. We're doing the same thing that we've always done, whether it's spinning cloth or whatever act that humans have done, and we're just taking the humans out of it. Do you think that that's kind of a hard and fast difference, or are those categories malleable, and why do they matter?
Well, I think if you look back in economic history, Jeremiah, for example, the really big transformation of the US auto industry, which Henry Ford was a key leader, you can see that what Ford did when he brought car production to an assembly line and when he also brought electricity to that assembly line is he absolutely automated away some of the artisanal jobs that existed before. So around 1900, the US produced about 3,500 cars a year, and those were all handcrafted, if you like. So Ford replaced a lot of those roles, and those tasks were taken over by machines. But he and the people who worked for him, and of course his competitors, also created a large number of new tasks, things that humans had never done before because they hadn't made any sense. And by the 1920s, the US car industry employed 400,000 people. They were making between 2 and 3 million cars a year. Of course, the cars were bought by the burgeoning middle class with massive transformative effects, both downstream in terms of how you use the cars, but also upstream, all the industries that produced for a wide variety of materials and components that went into cars, from steel on up. So that is, those things are complementary, they happen together. In retrospect, it is quite easy to see the distinction. Sometimes perhaps in the moment it may be unclear which is which, but yes, I think those are really quite distinct and really both really important processes that you need to identify and drill down into.
The book at times seems very skeptical of automation, and I don't know if that was intended or not, or if it's just a sort of qualified skepticism. But I'd love to just ask, in general, is automation good? Because the book tells a lot of stories about ways in which it can be not necessarily so good, but, the skeptic might just say, well, how is it not good if we can, use fewer humans to produce more stuff? In the end, society will be making more stuff overall, and that can only be good for humanity in the long run, right? How would you respond to that kind of skeptical point of view?
Well, first of all, I would say that our skepticism is qualified in the following sense that Simon and I are not against automation. Automation has been part of industrial innovation ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, and it will continue to be part of our future. What we try to argue is that automation has to be coupled with an effort to shepherd technology to create new capabilities and tasks for workers. What we are against is a singular focus on automation because we think it's not actually going to deliver in terms of productivity growth, and it's going to have pretty bad consequences for inequality, wages, workers in general. So if you want to think of it this way, yes, it's great that we automate routine jobs and create more meaningful, good jobs for workers. But if you look at what has happened in the United States over the last 4 decades, we've done the first part and not the latter part. So as a result, groups that used to perform these routine jobs actually have quite substantially lower earnings today than they used to. They became the losers of automation. So we got the destruction, but not the creation. And that's why at the beginning I said, what type of creative destruction you want? So many Silicon Valley people will say, this is just creative destruction. Look, we have to create some disruption. And if that disruption means there are no more blue collar workers, that's okay. No, That's only one type of creative destruction. An alternative, which we used to do exactly like Simon said with the Ford Motor Factories or the 3 decades after World War II of rapid growth, is we used to destroy some tasks because of automation, but create new ones. And that's what we're failing to do right now.
I love when a guest like perfectly sets up kind of the transition that I wanted, because I really wanted to ask how this applies to what a lot of economists are now talking about, which is this perceived middle and lower class stagnation over the last 4 decades in the US, as you said, kind of really post 1970s. We've seen that inequality has risen and wages have certainly not grown as quickly as productivity has. When I look at this, I'm curious about what the cause of this is. And I think there's a couple causes that you could point out. Certainly automation could be one reason for this, but a lot of people would just say, well, I'm not sure this is necessarily technology driven. This is just the result of macroeconomic mistakes that we've made. We've made political choices and economic choices that cause the economy to run in a suboptimal way. So I don't know, because when I look at, like, say, the most recent couple of years, we've finally gotten a hot economy. We've finally got really low unemployment. Inflation's running hot. And the result of that has been that inequality has actually lessened, post-COVID, which has been a very interesting phenomenon to watch. So how much of, the post-1970s malaise do you think is attributable to automation as opposed to other things like, well, we've just made poor political choices, we've made poor economic choices?
So you're right, Jeremiah. Attribution of what has happened is a really important question, and there's a lot of discussion and debate about it. Daron has done some of the pioneering work on this, including with various co-authors such as Pasquale Restrepo. So I think I'm qualified to judge their work. And I think the answer is that the big driving force and the sort of common thread of the last 40 years has been automation. Perhaps it's 60%, perhaps it's 70% of what's happened. Of course, there's also been globalization. I think you alluded to that. We've moved a lot of jobs overseas, but much of that globalization was made possible by technological change, including the same digital revolution that directly led to more automation. That's why communications became cheaper. That's why managing global businesses across borders is easier, and therefore more tasks get transferred to low-cost labor elsewhere. I think also in that same category, there was and we talk about this, there was a big change in corporate culture. So that while before, let's say, the 1980s, many corporate leaders thought that being good to workers was consistent with shareholder-oriented capitalism, after the 1980s, it was increasingly the case, and remains the case, that managers became much tougher on workers and much more about squeezing workers.
This is the Gordon Gekko kind of greed is good kind of wave of financing, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Gordon Gekko is straight out of the Milton Friedman playbook: business of businesses making money and doing business, nothing else. And of course, private equity, which is an extreme version of this, is also illustrates the extremes to which people pursuing this idea will go, including the way in which they really hammered workers repeatedly. So I think those are your long-term elements. Now, on the macroeconomic conditions and on whether you run the economy hot enough, that is a great question, of course. And you're totally right that the combination of COVID and how we've come out of COVID has led to both more inflation and higher wage growth for people with less skill at the lower end of the income distribution. But I would also point out that the Federal Reserve is working very hard right now to slow the economy down. And what does that slowing down mean when we take away the euphemisms? It means pushing up the effective unemployment rate or the underutilization of labor at the lower end of the income distribution. So I am not sure, Jeremiah, that we've really passed the stage of saying, or that we can say, oh, we've changed macro policy and we're going to get a better set of distributional outcomes. On the contrary, I think we'll look back and say, well, that COVID experience was a very particular phase, and those effects did not last that long.
And if I could add one thing, Jeremiah, Simon and I put a lot of emphasis on the institutional changes in the vision of the corporate leadership, what happened between capital and labor in general in terms of power and social prestige. But we also argue that a major channel via which these impact inequality and wages is technology. So the reason why, for example, we have used digital technologies mostly for automation, is inseparable from the vision of corporate leaders that they have to maximize short-term returns to their shareholders. And one easy way of doing that seems, let's cut labor costs by automating work. But that's not necessarily the only path. Which path you choose depends on institutions and social power, and hence our emphasis on power. And in fact, we argue it's not necessarily even the best path for the economy's aggregate productivity performance in the long run.
It's so interesting there that you mentioned institutions, because that's such a big theme in, some of your previous work, Daron. Why Nations Fail is about how institutions can influence growth, and the narrow corridor is about how we get those good institutions, the mystery of how good institutions arise. And one of the themes of the narrow corridor, if I could summarize it very badly and quickly, is that you need kind of countervailing power structures. You need not just all of society's power to be concentrated in one place, whether that be private or public, the state or someone else. If all of the power is in one place, that's typically going to be pretty bad for institutions. And you need kind of civil society and government and other things to counterbalance each other. And so I'm a big fan of those works of yours on institutions. And I'm curious if you saw kind of what you called the previous iteration of capitalism, where there was, worker power and then obviously corporate power and big important labor unions. Do you see that as fitting into your model of, society needs to have multiple centers of power that can balance each other out?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the frame that Simon and I are using here, but we're adding to it in two major ways. One is the emphasis that a major channel for this influence is through the direction of technology. So we are back again, the choice and malleability of technology. And second, we put a little bit more emphasis on visions. So it's not just your interests are clear, my interests are clear, and the question is whether we counterbalance each other. But it's also, if you have power and you're going to follow your visions and ideas or ideology, where do these come from? And what's the effect of these ideas? So in some sense, it is impossible to understand where the digital revolution went and where the current AI revolution is going without taking these ideas into account. And we argue, Simon and I argue, that these are just some of the ideas that the leaders of tech could have had. There are alternative ways of approaching technology and what it should do, and which ideas are actually prevailing has major consequences.
One of the other ideas that was just thrown out there that I'd love to circle back to is that this kind of obsession with disruption and this obsession with creative destruction, and we've got to automate things, technology, go, 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 and kind of that techno-optimist strain is not necessarily even the best way to grow the economy in the long run. One of the books that has been most influential on my thinking over the last few years is Robert Gordon's book. I think it's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And Robert Gordon is not like a household name. Maybe among economists he is now, but he argues that we've had unusually weak growth post 1970. And part of me just wonders, what if the problem isn't automation? What if the problem is just that what we're doing isn't producing growth at all? How many of our current issues would we even have right now if instead of growing at like 1% on average, we were growing at 2% on average? Because the classic statement is that, growth covers up a lot of sins. As long as you have a high rate of growth, typically things are going to be going well for you in the medium to long run. So I guess, I don't know, Simon, I'll direct this at you. When you think about just we're not growing enough, period, do you think that's because of the technology or because of some other thing? And would higher growth kind of cover up the multitude of sins that we've seen in the last 4 decades?
Well, it's a good question and a really tough sort of counterfactual hypothetical to answer.
I'm just asking you to, explain why economic growth happens. That's easy, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Look, I think there are, what drives growth in this country primarily, what's driven over the recent decades has been, what powerful people in the private sector think will generate profits for themselves and perhaps for their shareholders. If you go back to the post-war period, which is what Gordon focuses on, where we all agree growth was better, there was more government impetus. The Government moved into the business of supporting research and development during World War II, and then doubled down on that actually after the end of the war. And we got big increases in scientific knowledge and a spread of that knowledge across society because of those governmental efforts. And then we backed away from that in the 1960s and in the 1970s. So I think there are ways in which knowledge could have increased by more. You could have had more, a greater expansion of possibilities, maybe more breakthroughs in terms of science. Would that have covered up or removed all of the problems that we've now experienced? On that, I'm a little bit more doubtful, Jeremiah, because I think that the shift in corporate culture, the shift in the direction of technology, and the way in which technology was deployed could still have gone pretty much in the same direction. And of course, there are also people listening to this podcast who will worry about the environmental damage that you get when you accelerate growth. So I think the direction of technology is a really important standalone topic, related to, but also separate from, the rate at which you grow.
When I've interviewed people about inequality in the past, there's a lot of ways that you can think about current inequality in America and the Western world and why it's been increasing the last few decades. One kind of heterodox opinion that I've seen out there is that, well, inequality wouldn't be as much of a big deal if we didn't have cost of living crisis in so many key areas, if it wasn't so impossibly expensive to rent an apartment in most big cities, if we didn't have, college education becoming 5 or 10 times as expensive as it used to be, and you could keep going in areas like childcare and healthcare, that the idea here is that what we're seeing is not necessarily an income problem, but a cost problem in so many of our areas. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about, is that a valid perspective? Do we really need to work more on controlling costs in certain sectors? Or is this really, no, it's actually a distributional question of where income is going at a national level?
I think there's a truth to the cost of living crisis. But first of all, it isn't the main factor, because if you look at, for example, the nominal earnings of low education people in the United States, it has by and large stagnated, and that's why the real earnings have fallen. But in fact, even that picture does not do justice how severe their situations are, because many low education people live in major metropolitan areas such as New York, Boston, San Francisco, where housing costs have gone up a lot. And so their real incomes may have fallen even more than what first meets the eye. But the reason for that is, again, related to the uneven pattern of economic growth. What we have done is we have used technology to favor the very well-educated, those with specialized skills, especially in tech and related areas. They have so much money that costs of living in the metropolitan areas where they live are increasing, and low education people are not keeping up with it. So we really need, again, a different growth model. And the key point, which Simon also emphasized in his answer to your previous question, that growth model could actually improve the growth prospects of the American economy as well. There is something very strange if you think of labor just as a cost to be cut. That means you're not really leveraging the human skills that you have access to. If you're a manager and you think that all of your workers are just there to be eliminated, how are you going to get productivity improvements, new ideas, creativity out of your workers? That's what I think we need to do with new technology and the perspectives of the corporate leaders.
This seems like the kind of thing that's the difference between a manager of a business and an economist. From a narrow perspective of a manager, cutting labor cost, it is definitely a rational choice. But from an economist point of view, like, you want your labor to be productive and you want there to be a lot of it. You want high labor force participation rates. And so, I kind of get the businessman's perspective, but also...
But I think the businessman perspective, no, but I'm not going to give in on that one. I think it makes sense from a narrow point of view. If you're a businessman and who thinks that there isn't anything you can do with your labor and the shareholders are on your throat and they want higher returns next year, yes, perhaps then trying to eliminate labor, automate workers, or squeeze them harder makes sense. But actually, if we adopt a broader strategy of leveraging digital technologies to increase human productivity, business people could advance their businesses much farther by creating new products, more creativities, new tasks, better decision making by their employees. I think there's a high road that will actually be beneficial for businesses as well, but it does require us to choose a different direction of technology.
So just to add a historical example there, in the late 19th century, when the US went from being something of a backwater to the world's leading industrial power, they developed a system in the northern part of the US, which people refer to now as the American system of manufacturing, which was all about managers and owners of capital focused on returns to shareholders. They put a lot of effort into making more productive use of unskilled labor, because there wasn't a lot of skilled labor in the US. So making unskilled labor more productive through forms of mechanization and forms of bringing machines into factories. So Henry Ford is the culmination of this, but there's many, many people who came before him who were pushing in that same direction. And that wasn't about, firing workers. Okay, they did fight with workers about how much to share the productivity gains in terms of higher wages. Sure, there was plenty of that. But these were the robber barons, if you like, were creating new tasks. They were increasing the demand for labor, and then they were arguing with workers about the wages. But they were absolutely not focused on, hey, how many workers can we fire this quarter, and is that going to impress the stock market? They were all about creating, expanding, and enhancing the skills or the effectiveness of workers who didn't have a lot of formal education.
One of the ways in which I've been kind of summarizing the book in my own head is that technology and automation are necessary in the long run, but they're not sufficient in terms of if we want to create the society we want. We need these things, but they're not going to be enough by themselves. But and if you disagree with that necessary but not sufficient framing, please let me know. But I think that raises the question, well, what would make it sufficient? In addition to technology and automation in the long run, we also need what? And so I would ask that question. Maybe I'll throw this one at you, Simon. What is it that we need to complement those things? Because I don't think anybody would say, well, let's just go without, let's just degrowth ourselves. But what actually is added to the mix to make the sort of growth positive society that everybody can share in the wealth? What makes that happen?
Well, first of all, there are people arguing for degrowth, and we're not among them. So let's be clear about that. So I think necessary but not sufficient is pretty close to our position. I think we're very much about the choices that are made in the direction of technology, but we can fit that within that framework, Jeremiah. Clearly, historically, what made it sufficient was countervailing power. So if you look at the 19th century and look what happened in the UK, US, other European countries, where living standards did eventually improve with industrialization, it was the rise of political voice and representation for a broader segment of society. It was trade unions. It was the role of government in regulation. So I think historically, it's pretty clear that's how the benefits of higher productivity were shared in terms of wages, better health, more opportunity for more people, and so on. I think the tougher question is now, given that countervailing powers have been greatly weakened over recent decades, given the way that the ideology of capitalism has shifted and remains shifted, where do we get the countervailing powers now? And Daron and I have got a few ideas about that hopefully we can discuss. But it's not as easy as saying, let's go back to where we were in the 1880s or 1920s, because you can't go back to that same structure of the economy. But we are trying to solve the same problem, which is to bring countervailing power into the mix with innovators, with entrepreneurs, get the growth, but share the benefits.
There are points in the book where you advocate for potentially less technocracy, less kind of managerialism and more democratic input. Do you think that that's part of what's necessary here, is kind of having more democratic input and having more public say in the direction technology takes?
I do think that's important. And one reason why broader participation in the direction of technology is that once you admit technology has many directions and some of them will benefit a small elite, some of them are going to create more broad-based gains, then it becomes quite problematic when the direction of technology is in the hands of a very small clique. They tend to be homogeneous, they tend to have their own vision, they tend to have their own economic and social interests, and they're going to shepherd technology in a very specific direction. How can we prevent that? Well, you can bring a different small elite, but that's not like a healthy relation to go one fluctuation from one to the other. It's sort of a broader set of countervailing powers seems like the best way. And that's exactly what happened, for example, in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. The first phase had many parallels to today, lots of inequality, stagnant wages, harsh working conditions. But then in the second part, the direction of technology changed, the sharing of the gains changed, better investment in public infrastructure. Why? Well, you had the institutional transformation of the United Kingdom through democratization, labor voice via trade unions becoming better organized. So that, I think, is a good blueprint for the future as well, except that democratic control becomes much harder when democracy is failing. And now that's another issue with digital technologies and AI. They have created a vicious circle where they have also damaged democratic participation.
So let me just add again a historical example, which is stark, but I think quite appropriate, which is in the 1840s, people became aware that the benefits of the Industrial Revolution in Britain had not been widely shared. Industrial Revolution had been going on for at least 120 years, and small children were working in coal mines, pushing carts of coal with their heads deep underground. And as this became widely known and more properly understood, there was a clamor for regulation of child labor in general, and including in coal mines. And many of the people who owned coal mines and the so-called technical experts, at least the ones who got the profits from these enterprises, they argued strenuously that this would absolutely destroy coal mining and maybe industry and maybe Britain, because people just didn't understand how coal mining worked and what coal was all about and why you needed tiny children in tiny shafts underground. And you know what? They did pass factory reform. They did constrain the use of child labor. They did move towards mandatory schooling, and everybody was better as a result. And I think leaving any of these technical issues to people who are or claim to be technical experts is generally a mistake. And that's not the basis of modern democracy for a good reason.
And just to clarify, Simon and I are not arguing that there should be a democratic process of writing code, that we should collectively decide how to design the next large language models. But neither are we arguing that the public should be involved in building nuclear code either. But the public can have a say on whether you want to develop nuclear energy versus nuclear weapons. And in the same way, the public can be very well informed about what the different directions of AI will bring and can have a say which direction we actually favor.
I'd love to play devil's advocate here for just a minute, and recognizing that we certainly have some points here that are valuable. In the case where child labor is being used, I think it's completely valid for the public to get together and say, we don't approve of that, and we'd like to ban that. And acknowledging that, the tech elites are definitely, narrow-minded, and they have kind of one shared vision that's not very diverse, and it certainly can be just narrowly focused at times. But that line about the public should have a say in whether or not we build nuclear energy is interesting, because I view nuclear energy as a very, very positive thing and something that we should be developing to help stop climate change. But the public is often against it. And if you let them vote on it, they'll often vote to stop you from building it. And there's a lot of ways in which, on kind of a micro level, we're kind of drowning in democratic input to our detriment. In my home of New York City, it's nearly impossible to build housing because of how many community input hearings and community boards and city council, public statements, and the process of having to go through all of this, what is mostly a democratic process, allows anyone to gum it up and anyone to stop, a new housing development from happening. And part of me thinks that, democratic input is very good in the abstract, but perhaps just in the same way that the tech elites can be narrow-minded, democratic input can also be abused to just stop things from happening.
There's no doubt that democratic process can be corrupted. And there's also no doubt, at least in my mind, that the democratic process has been malfunctioning in the United States and in many other nations over the last 2-3 decades. The question is, when you have major decisions, such as nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, who else are we going to entrust them other than the informed public? And here the informed is very important. I completely agree with you, by the way, on nuclear energy. I think it was a mistake for many European nations to stop or to decommission their nuclear power plants. But I see that as a decision that many people may have a different view than me. And part of it is also information. I think the correct information wasn't given to them, especially about how difficult it would be to create a transition to renewable energy without nuclear power being part of the equation. And there are many different ways in which the democratic process can be corrupted. Like, for example, when people go into the NIMBY mode and use local democracy, not in the way that it was meant to be exercised, but as a way of blocking, construction projects. But I just don't see an alternative to having a broad participation in these critical decisions, because the distributional element of these decisions is so important that whenever you delegate them to a small group, you're going to get worse outcomes. So I think we have to improve democracy, which is, and a very important part of our book, trying to both explain why digital technologies have the potential to improve democracy and why, on the contrary, again, the direction being critical here, why, on the contrary, they have been used to centralize the control of information and weaken democracy.
Yeah, I would just add on this specifically the history of nuclear energy. As I think you know, Jeremiah, in and immediately after World War II, the prestige of physicists was incredibly high. It was one of the most highly regarded groups in the United States. And decisions about development of nuclear energy for civilian purposes were entrusted to those experts, who were, I think, in retrospect, I think it's fair to say, somewhat arrogant, certainly over exuberant about the technology, including famously that the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission famously promised free electricity in the 1950s. And I think that overpromising and the lack of constraint, as well as the broader realization of environmental damage, wasn't only nuclear, of course. It was linked to pesticides and the work of Rachel Carson and the entire understanding of spillover effects coming from industrial development, which was also reflected a lack of democratic constraint on what companies could do. That, combined with some fairly spectacular accidents or near misses, that undermined the credibility of nuclear energy industry. And the reason that you and others are struggling, and you and Daron, for example, are struggling to persuade people nuclear energy has an important role potentially to play in the green transition, is because previous generations of elites were not sufficiently open to democratic input and were rather dismissive of the legitimate concerns that people who were not technical experts put forward about unintended consequences.
Or actually, let me add one other thing to this, Jeremiah, because I think our point here could be misunderstood in one other way. Simon and I are definitely not arguing, far from it. We're not arguing against use of technical expertise. I think technical expertise is key in many of the decisions that are going to face humanity, from pandemics to climate change to artificial intelligence to design of better fiscal programs. But we are arguing that you cannot let a small group, be they technical experts or AI programmers, make all the decisions. So the broader set of voices need to be heard.
I think that's completely fair. And I struggle with this myself, in that, NIMBYism is probably the most aggravating force in the world for me personally. But I understand why it exists, in the sense that, when Robert Moses was, bulldozing minority neighborhoods so he could build freeways, it was genuinely a bad thing that those, minority neighborhoods had no say in what was happening and just their whole neighborhood was bulldozed. That's pretty bad. We've now swung to the area where anybody who objects to something in their neighborhood can block it indefinitely. And that's also bad. And it strikes me we need some sort of balance between community input and democratic control, and the technocracy should also have some say in what happens. And I'm not smart enough to figure out how to make that balance happen. But maybe you guys are. Maybe that's the next book. One of the other things that strikes me in this book, as we talk about the idea of potentially regulating technology companies or putting democratic control in front of technology decisions, is that there's a great divide in the technology world and in the kind of developed world, I would say between America and Europe in the approach to the technology sector. America is obviously more in love with the tech sector. America has a much bigger and more robust and innovative tech sector. And Europe, if I just stereotype it a little bit, it certainly does more regulation, seems more technology skeptical and more eager to kind of bring down the regulatory hammer on their tech companies or on American tech companies. And in response, you could argue whether this is a cause or effect, but Europe has very little innovation in their technology sector. There are very few big European technology firms. I wonder, do you think about that in terms of, are we aiming for a more European style? Are we aiming for a more American style? Do we worry about the consequences of that? Or is that kind of a false framing in your eye? Is that not the way we should be thinking about the choices that you're asking us to make?
I think that's an excellent question, but I would say we would like to have the best of both worlds. Think of Silicon Valley. At some level, it's an amazing achievement. I don't think there is any other area of such size that has played such an innovative role in human history for quite a long period of time, 40 years, 50 years. And, Silicon Valley's innovation engine is inseparable from risk-taking, some amount of individualism, the market process, obviously, the sort of the allure of getting very rich. All of these are very important. I don't think the United States wants to abandon that innovative energy. But also Silicon Valley brings a very distorted perspective to what we want the technologies to do and ignores a lot of the damages that technologies, especially when they go in the direction of destruction, displacement of workers because of automation, surveillance, information collection, distorted lenses through which communication takes place on social media, and today with the direction of AI. So the question is, can we have the good part of that risk-taking energy without the bad part? And the answer is yes. I think with the right amount of regulation, we can do that. If you look at, Simon referred to this already, the decades that followed World War II, there was an enormous amount of innovative energy in the corporate world, but that was to some degree regulated and partly directed by the Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, that spearheaded things like computers, antibiotics, sensors, aerospace innovation. So regulation and the market process are not incompatible, and regulation and risk-taking and innovation are not incompatible. And in this context, I think Europeans, yes, you're absolutely right. I think they are much more aggressive in regulation, partly because they don't have the companies that will bear the brunt of that regulation, but also they have the right idea on a number of issues like what will AI do? What will lack of privacy and ceaseless data collection will imply? The problem is that this type of regulation is not easy. When you take something like the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation of the Europeans, it has the right sort of ideas, but it hasn't worked very well. It has backfired in some ways because we are dealing with a very complex technology, a very fast-moving technology. So you have to regulate it, try it, what works, what doesn't work. And the United States government has completely abrogated its obligation to create a regulatory institutional framework that we need to rebuild. And I think if we do that in the right way, then we can have the best of both worlds.
I would suggest, Jeremiah, there is a split in the world, but it's not the one that you're emphasizing. If you think about surveillance, for example, obviously one facet of the advances in AI is a lot more workplace surveillance and also social surveillance. And some of that may be legitimate, for example, if you're making workers safer when they deliver goods around the city. But some of it, I think, will be or is regarded as not legitimate, including if you're pressing the workers too hard, you're making them more dangerous in how they drive, certainly, and maybe if you're just making their lives a complete misery. So I think that the US and Europe are going to take the same side on that, and we're going to have some appropriate safeguards introduced in those countries, and they'll run roughly parallel. There may even be some agreement on that. I think other countries, including China, will not take the same view on surveillance. I think China is already apparently quite keen on further surveillance of all kinds, and they'll use that to squeeze their workers. And that will be a major, and they'll export those technologies, by the way. And I think the world will fall into two camps: those with safeguards on surveillance, including facilitated by AI, and those without effective safeguards. And that second camp will be largely authoritarian, because those cheaper surveillance technologies without safeguards make it easier to be authoritarian, to rule with a heavy hand. So I think that's going to be the split, Jeremiah, how we use technology. And that's going to be a split that lines up more or less with, who's democratic control, where there is voice that can be expressed when the technology leads in the wrong direction or is excessive.
I think that's a really valuable point, and it's a great point. There were points in the book when we get to like specific policy recommendations where I found myself disagreeing. But when you think about the larger point of technology can be used in horrible ways without democratic input, and you think about it not from an American perspective, but from a Communist Party of China perspective, the point is very, very clear that you can create a dystopia with technology without any sort of control on it. So I think it's we can have our, relatively smaller policy disagreements while still, I fully acknowledge that point, and it's a very good one. I want to go back to kind of the framing that Daron had, which was, we try to take the best of both the European approach and the American approach. And obviously, if you can, you'd love to have the best of both worlds. The counter argument to that from someone out in Silicon Valley who's a venture capitalist or whatever, they're enmeshed in that world. I would hear them argue, and I have heard them argue, if you try to do these things that you're saying you want to do, in the final chapter of the book, you talk about potentially breaking up some of the big tech firms. You talk about repealing Section 230, that some of these things would basically kill the golden goose, that you can't have the best of both worlds, and you're going to have to accept some level of like the tech sector gets to do what it wants if you want it to continue to be this sparkling, amazing place. And that, these specific reforms you're talking about would end up actually just hurting people overall. How would you respond to that, Daron, when it comes to the argument we can have the best of both approaches versus you can't actually have both of them? You have to accept some of the good with the bad.
Well, let me actually first say something that I think it's great that you disagree with our policy proposals, because we emphasize that these policy proposals are there to generate ideas. To us, the most important part of the agenda is to fix the aspiration. The aspiration is to redirect technology in a way that is more pro-human or humanist, increase worker tasks, increase human capabilities, empower citizens to make better, more informed decisions. Once we agree on that aspiration, I think we are 50% of the way there in terms of improving the conversation on technology.
And I just want to break in and say that I don't disagree with everything. There's some things that I think are great. Like, I think the government should be spending more on basic scientific research and development, full in agreement there. But just, the normal process of, some things I think are good, some are bad.
Absolutely. And but that's exactly what I'm coming, Jeremiah. And and then the second step is, for this we need to change the narrative, we need to build countervailing powers. I think again, if we agree on that, that's great. And then the specific proposal, there may be better ones than the ones we suggest. Some of the ones that we have, just like the GDPR that the Europeans tried, may backfire. I think we are completely open to that, and we welcome people to come up with better policy proposals in the service of this better aspiration. But in doing that, let's remember that the United States, for the 3.5 decades after World War II, looked not so different from Europe in that it had an antitrust policy, it had much greater regulation, the government had a bigger say in the direction of research, and the United States was very, very innovative in terms of aggregate productivity performance. It was doing better, quite a bit better than it has done during any point during the digital age. So I don't think we need to settle for, the only way you can improve distribution and democratic processes is by giving up on the innovativeness of Silicon Valley. I don't think that's the right choice.
Yeah, so a good specific example would be the way that social media has developed, and particularly the activities of Facebook around the world. And it is a matter of that has been completely accepted and established that Facebook's policies in some countries, for example, Myanmar, were extremely irresponsible when it was brought to their attention that their technology and the specific way in which it was being used, which could have been modified, that was not just exacerbating polarization, but actually feeding ethnic hatred and violence. The Facebook response was to do nothing. And I think, the people who run the tech sector have these choices, Jeremiah, and they have made choices, and they've made choices of how they interpret and operate under Section 230. And we are not opposed at all to innovation or to responsible creativity on the part of the corporate sector. But when you have the kind of abuse of power and mistreatment of people that we have seen and that has been established beyond any reasonable doubt around the world, of course you have to respond. I mean, that's like saying, oh, well, there are children working in the coal mines in the 1840s, and that's just something that has to happen for civilization to continue. I mean, that was a ridiculous view then, and it's a ridiculous view now to say that companies in Silicon Valley or anywhere can behave and treat people and individuals in any way they want because somehow capitalism will not continue and there won't be prosperity without them. I mean, that's nonsense, and it has to be, these excesses and these abuses have to be addressed in a responsible manner.
There was one point in the final chapter that I found really fascinating, and I'm going to try to summarize it myself in your words, and let me know if I do a bad job, and then ask you to kind of explain it a little bit further. There was a point in the last chapter, I believe it was during a discussion of UBI, Universal Basic Income, where, we're talking in the last chapter about, as so many books do, what are the policies that can address all the problems that we've discussed up to this point. And certainly if inequality is a problem and we've had rising inequality, one of the natural responses is going to be give people money. And I'm very sympathetic to that. And to the extent that we have a welfare state, I think it should be as simple as possible. Just giving people money is a good option. It will help bring them out of poverty. But you make the point that, well, UBI might be a good thing. It might be a bad thing. You can have your opinion on that, but it won't actually solve the problem, which is that the direction of technology still needs to be adjusted such that it, is actually benefiting people in the long run. And I believe your point is, just cutting people a check isn't good enough.
It's not good enough. Yeah, it's absolutely.
Have I accurately said that?
You have absolutely said it. You have absolutely got it. But I would add one other thing to that, which is that it's actually UBI may make things worse because it is somewhat defeatist. If you look at many of the arguments for UBI, and I don't know your exact reasoning, Jeremiah, but many of the arguments for UBI is we are moving towards a jobless future and we are moving towards greater and greater inequality. That's inevitable. That's why we need UBI. And that's the defeatism of it. We are saying, no, we don't need to move to a future like that. We can move to a future in which we have much better tools, much better capabilities in the hands of workers of all skill levels. And if we can move to that future, we don't need UBI because we're going to have a more vibrant labor market in which people of different skill levels can still earn a decent living like they did in the 1950s and 60s. So if that's the case, just signing up for UBI has a degree of defeatism in it.
Is this kind of the pre-distribution versus redistribution argument in a sense?
Yep, absolutely. It is pre-distribution versus redistribution, but the key is not just human capital and education, but the key is technology. Technology and institutions recreating a pre-distribution that's more favorable to labor, especially labor that's not just, designers and tech gurus.
So just as an example of this and where we are globally on this issue, Jeremiah, I was at a book festival in Hay-on-Wye in the UK over the weekend with another Johnson, Paul Johnson, who's the head of the Institute of Fiscal Studies in the UK. And we were talking about inequality and talking about the same sort of issues we're going through with you today. And Paul was explaining to this quite large audience of British people how hard it was to adjust the distributional outcomes in the UK, given the political economy of taxation and so on. And to which I said exactly what original Daron said, which is you need to go upstream. So what we've done in our the way the modern state operates is you let the market do its thing. You get an allocation of incomes. People get various wages and returns on capital and so on. And then you see what you can redistribute. And that you may have various ideas about what's better ways to do that or not. But if you can go upstream, if you can get into the process through which that initial distribution of incomes is produced, and that's where the technology and direction of technology comes in, that can be transformative. And that changes the political conversation completely and opens up a lot of new possibilities. And I'm with Daron on the UBI. I think just to retreat to UBI I don't think it's that efficient as a way to help people, but I think it also concedes the ground, all the important ground to the people who want to drive technology in a particular direction that's a very elitist and unequalizing direction.
I think it's an interesting perspective. I'm kind of medium to neutral on UBI myself. My real point of view is that, if we're going to be giving people help through a welfare state, there should just not be very many conditions on it. We shouldn't means test and work requirements and, cash is better than in kind. But, whether or not we should move to kind of the full UBI model, I have no comment there. But it's an interesting discussion about pre-distribution versus redistribution. We are running up on time now, so I want to ask the traditional final question that we ask every guest on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in the ideas that we've been talking about today, what would you recommend for them? And I'll start and say, obviously, the first thing we should recommend is the book Power in Progress by Simon Johnson and Daron Acemoğlu. Everybody, you can go pick that up at any bookseller near you. But other than your own book, what would you recommend? And this could be a blog, it could be a white paper, it could be a nonfiction book or someone to follow on Twitter. Just for people who are interested in all of these subjects, what would you recommend?
Well, let me take the easy one. Simon and I are co-leading a new center together with David Otter, my colleague here at MIT Economics, on shaping the future of work. And the center is trying to do the underlying research as well as the policy work on creating better jobs for workers. And I encourage people to visit our website, and there will be a lot more information on the policy dimensions of this. And I'll let Simon talk more about other resources.
Yeah, so our website is shapingwork, all one word, .mit.edu. And we do post a lot of resources and links there, including to various people writing about these issues who don't necessarily agree with us. There's also a network, Jeremiah, supported by the Hewlett Foundation, of various independent research groups at different universities and other places around the US. And with the Ford Foundation, actually, there's support for people doing similar work around the world. And we will have links to those people and places on our website so people can explore a set of related but surely distinct perspectives on these issues. And there's a lot of substantive research and policy writing from all those people.
All right, well, one more time. The book is Power and Progress by Daron Acemoğlu and Simon Johnson. Daron and Simon, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. It was a great conversation.